This is Tom Fox, and I would like to welcome you to the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network, Greetings and Felicitations. In this podcast series, I'm going to be visiting with thought leaders, entrepreneurs, historians, and a wide variety of other people on topics that are outside the area of compliance, but are of great interest to myself and to listeners to the Compliance Podcast Network. Today we start a 5-part podcast series on some of the science around Star Trek. In this exploration, I'm joined by my good friend Ben Locwin. Ben is a healthcare futurist, and he's also an astrophysicist, so he's uniquely situated to talk about the science of Star Trek. We had a lot of fun producing this series, and I hope you will enjoy it, listening to it as much as Ben and I did bringing it to you. Well, Ben, today I wanted to use the episode Tomorrow is Yesterday as a starting point to talk about some things such as black holes, white holes, and my favorite science fiction construct, wormholes. And in Tomorrow is Yesterday, the Enterprise was thrown back into Earth time frame in the 1960s by the effects of what it called a high-gravity black star. The Enterprise did not know it was there, got sucked into it, and then had to blast out with its warp engines, and in doing so, engaged in time travel back to the mid-60s. The Enterprise ended up in the upper atmosphere of the continental United States and was picked up as a UFO on military radar. A F-4 interceptor was sent up to investigate the plane. The Enterprise saw the plane, fearing an attack. Captain Kirk ordered a tractor beam to be used on the plane. The plane's thin veneer, the tractor beam disintegrated it, and the captain of the plane, Captain John Christopher, was beamed aboard the Enterprise. The Enterprise worked to get back to its original time frame, and to do so, they came up with the idea that they would warp out of the Earth's atmosphere towards the sun, our sun, and then by using a slingshot method, would use the gravity of the sun to whip around the sun, kick in the warp drive, and return to their own time. Of course, as with all Enterprise or Star Trek episodes, the maneuver was very risky, and even a small miscalculation could have destroyed the ship and ended the series. So Kirk, however, does approve the maneuver, and the Enterprise is successful, and time starts to move backwards. This allows them to return Captain Christopher to his plane immediately before it disintegrated, and allowed the Enterprise to successfully return to the 23rd century. So I guess we do get to start with black holes, because that's something that is now, I think, fairly well known and understood. But you want to start there, or do you want to start somewhere else?
No, that sounds great. So let's see. We've got to presume that the screenwriters for the show meant black hole when they talked about a black star. So the name black hole itself was one that was coined by physicist John Wheeler, and Einstein and others had some tremendous problems with the idea of black holes existing. So let me explain what it is first. So a black hole is what you're left with after you've got so much mass occupying a small unit of space that its gravity becomes so strong that not even light can escape it. So where these things tend to originate from is from collapsing stars of varying high masses. So as a star approaches the end of its life cycle, what happens is it burns fuel differently throughout different phases of its life cycle, and generally what you would be left over in a lot of cases is a star shrinking down to a white dwarf star. And what Subramanian Chandrasekhar discovered in 1930 was that if you've got a white dwarf that has a certain amount of mass left over after it's done its dying process and shedding of mass, if it's left with 1.44 solar masses, so 1.44 times the mass of our sun, left over after this. It doesn't have enough internal energy to prevent further collapse, and so then it will become either a neutron star or a black hole. So in sequence, what's happening is you've got this star that's at least 1.44 times the mass of our sun left over as it's approaching the end of its life cycle, and it would like to collapse more, but at the moment what's called electron degeneracy pressure is holding it together. So the Pauli exclusion principle prevents certain subatomic particles of the same quantum properties from occupying the same space. So because this is mathematically forbidden, the electron pressure is what's holding the star up. But once it exceeds this mass threshold, there's no way to stop further collapse, and it collapses down. The next phase down would be, as I mentioned, a neutron star, where now you've got a star that essentially is made of just crushed composite neutrons. And so this would be the most smooth object in the universe, I think, that we probably could ever find. So you've got something that's trying to contract in all directions, and why gravitationally bound objects like planets, for example, form spheres is because the most viable way to occupy a volume of space most efficiently is in the form of a sphere. So now you've got so much mass and density in a very small volume of space that it's essentially forming a virtually perfect sphere. If there's still too much mass for this neutron core to hold up with what's called neutron degeneracy pressure, it continues to collapse down into a black hole. And so this becomes a point at which it essentially pinches off through the fabric of space-time. So it forms around itself, which you may have heard about, called an event horizon. And this essentially is a shroud beyond which no light or matter or energy of any kind can escape that's passed through this event horizon. If you were to fly to the event horizon and try to proceed through it, you would be able to pass into the black hole. And then there's a process that Kip Thorne, who's a famous astrophysicist who helped come up with the idea of wormholes from your intro, he talks about. It's called spaghettification, where the tidal forces as you enter the black hole become so great that, let's say you go through head first, the gravitational forces at the top of your head are so much greater than those at your feet, because your feet are further away from the core of the black hole, that you essentially get stretched out into a string of atoms on your way into getting crushed at the singularity. So, that being what a black hole is, I think some of this brings us back to the previous episode we talked about with time travel in this one. I think there are some relativistic effects that we have to be concerned about. It's interesting because the gravity at the limb of a black hole is so high that if you could travel to just outside the event horizon and keep firing the thrusters on your rocket, the gravity is so strong there that time is going to pass slower for you than others who are outside the proximity of the black hole where they're under influence of its gravity. And this could be quite a substantial effect. This was used in the movie Interstellar with Matthew McConaughey, where they used some of this gravitational well effect in order to change some of the time effects for the actors and for the storyline. I think, if we think about how this all might fit together, it's interesting because the first black hole that was ever imaged, I think, was in 1971. And, like I said earlier, Einstein thought that it just wouldn't be possible to have a black hole. It would be too strange for Mother Nature to allow black holes to exist. But in April of this year, we have gotten pictures of the shadow of a black hole for the first time ever. So typically in the past, what we would do is try to image the centers of galaxies and look for tremendously high masses in compact volumes that would indicate the presence of a black hole. And now we've got some of our first images that have come out in 2019 of this. So we seem to have irrefutable evidence that, as strange as they are, black holes, absolutely do exist. The question becomes, can they be used to create a wormhole or to travel in time? Well, certainly you could fiddle around with time travel, like I said. If you get close enough to one and you're in the gravitational limb, time will pass much more slowly for you, which means you could then proceed into everyone else's future because time has passed more slowly. Everyone else has aged around you. But I think typically when we talk about sci-fi, that's not what folks mean. Can you travel through a wormhole from one place to another? Mathematically, this is something that people have wrestled with for quite some time. As I mentioned, Kip Thorne, who was science advisor in the movie Interstellar, he was a professor at Caltech. He did some of the early equations on wormholes and tried to figure out how they could potentially be possible. And after he looked at them for quite some time in the early 90s, tried to figure out reasons why they should remain improbable. So we don't tend to have a lot of evidence that wormholes exist. And if you run the equations, it looks like if a wormhole did pop up somewhere, it would be tremendously tenuous. And the only thing that would seem to keep a wormhole open, in some sense that we could somehow use it for space-time travel, would be negative mass. And, that's at the moment just a sci-fi trope. We don't actually know what negative mass would look like. And so at the moment, I think we're sufficiently protected from time travel like this through wormholes. Unfortunately, maybe, depending on what your bent is. But Stephen Hawking in 2011 had written about, well, in the past he had done so too, but talked about space tourists. And he talked about what he called the chronology protection conjecture, which is essentially that Mother Nature tries to protect the overall chronology of the universe. And his Hawking's cutting quote was, if time travel's possible, then where are all the tourists from the future? So they should be basically overrunning us now. If there was a way in the future for us to travel back to our past, which is currently now, why don't we see future tourists all over the place? And so it seems to most physicists at the moment that somehow the universe prevents any sort of time paradoxes from existing. And, again, I think it's certainly a fun concept to think about. And, one of the interesting ones is the grandfather paradox. So if you go back in time and kill your grandfather, would that prevent you from being born so that you could never go back and kill your grandfather? And, I think because that presents serious philosophical problems to the universe, it doesn't seem that time travel, at least as we envision it in science fiction, is a real thing. Though it certainly is true that if you travel at different rates of speed, you can record different times elapsing. People who fly at high velocity, we've done this before via NASA and Air Force experiments. Very sensitive clocks can, even at the low rates of speed that we achieve currently relative to the speed of light, can demonstrate that the time dilation effect is exactly within the confidence intervals that Einstein's relativistic equations would predict. So time is flowing slower the higher the speed that you're traveling at. So if you were to travel at very high rates of speed in a rocket ship, you would indeed have time passing slower for you than others. So in that sense, sure, there is time travel going on relative to you and others.
Ben, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time, but this has been yet another fascinating exploration, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks. Me too, Tom.
This is Tom Fox again. I hope you enjoyed our inaugural episode of Greetings and Felicitations. As I said in the intro, we're going to be exploring a wide variety of topics, some compliance related, some not. So I hope you will join me in this most interesting adventure. Greetings and Felicitations is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. We have 2 other great new podcasts out on the Compliance Podcast Network. Check out From the Editor's Desk, where I visit with Compliance Week Editor-in-Chief Dave Lafort for a monthly wrap-up of Compliance Week stories and events, and the ESG Report, the first ESG podcast related to compliance. This is Tom Fox again. I hope you enjoyed our inaugural episode of Greetings and Felicitations. As I said in the intro, we're going to be exploring a wide variety of topics, some compliance related, some not. So I hope you will join me in this most interesting adventure. Greetings and Felicitations is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. We have two other great new podcasts out on the Compliance Podcast Network. Check out From the Editor's Desk, where I visit with Compliance Week Editor-in-Chief Dave Lafort for a monthly wrap-up of Compliance Week stories and events, and the ESG Report, the first ESG podcast related to compliance.